I grew up in a time before the internet, and I can remember when I first saw Star Wars. I did not see it in theaters. I wasn't born then, but I was a few years old when Return of the Jedi hit, and my uncles and everyone. It was kind of a cultural thing at the time. So I grew up with Star Wars. I remember having watch parties with my cousins when we'd go to my parents would take us back to California where they were from when I was a very little child. Um, and my dad would go work with his brother, and my cousins and I and my brother, we would just watch the trilogy. We would rented my uncle would rent VHSs, and we would just you know watch those, and it was great. And I grew up with those, and because I grew up right after they came out, or was born right after they came out, I was born in 1980. Um, and it's more so for the people who came before me. There was a period of a decade, essentially, before Lucas started producing more Star Wars content. During that time, he went through a divorce and all this other stuff. Um, but the first was the tabletop stuff, and then came the Thrawn novels, and that spawned the whole new series of books. And in there was also like the original Tales of the Jedi comics from Dark Horse and some other stuff. And then that led to the THX editions of the films. And then that led to the special editions of the films, not getting re-released in theaters. And then that led to the new trilogy, the prequel trilogy that Lucas did. And then that spawned the Clone Wars and everything else. But all of that was done, for the most part. I think by the time they got to the new trilogy of films, the prequel trilogy, they had launched the website. But I grew up in a time with no StarWars.com. And I remember having a subscription to Star Wars Insider, um, back in the day, which was a great magazine. That's where we got all of our Star Wars information, especially all the information leading up to like the first big Star Wars conference, which was in Denver, Colorado, where in the area where I lived, and I went to that show at the Air Force Base, and it was freaking amazing. I got to meet so many, like Ray Park was there, Warwick Davis was there, um, Anthony Daniels was there. Terry Brooks was there, which is one of my favorite fantasy authors, and at the time he had written um, the treatment for the Phantom Menace. They had life-size X-wings, the Lego store where I blew like $700. Um, it was a great time. But flash forward to where we are today, where we're getting new shows every couple of months. There's a website, there's all this social media, there's video games coming out all the time, and I see people there are a vocal minority who like to complain about Disney Plus Star Wars things, and it drives me up the wall, um, because I grew up in a time when there was no we had a decade of nothing, and even when Lucas started producing more stuff, it was still sporadic. I mean, yes, we got a new prequel trilogy and we got the Clone Wars show, but it was still not. We didn't have tons of video games out. We had video games every few years. Social media was not what it is today, so we didn't get this whole, new saturation of Star Wars content. So we still were drip fed very much. And I will never, ever, ever want to go back to that. I love Star Wars. I've loved Star Wars since I was like 3 years old. Um, and I will love it until they put me in the grave. And you cannot take that away from me. Like, just because you happen to dislike certain aspects of the films or the shows or whatever doesn't take away from the fact that you're living in a time when you're getting all sorts of Star Wars. It is a beautiful time to be alive. Like the amount of Star Wars content. And same thing goes for like Star Trek. Like there are so many Star Trek shows and this goes for Star Wars as well. There are so many things coming out around Star Wars and Star Trek. I can't keep up with them all. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Like there are some of the animated shows that I haven't watched for Star Trek. I haven't read some of the High Republic stuff that is coming out for Star Wars. Um, I think it's a great time to be alive, and I think it's a great time to be a Star Wars and a Star Trek fan. Um, has Disney made some mistakes along the way? Sure, but who cares? Like I challenge anyone, especially those of you who have never done anything creative before. Um, I say this as someone who has over 20 million words in circulation that I've been paid to produce on the internet since I started writing as a career in 2008. Not everything you produce is going to be amazing. Some of it's going to be subpar. Some of it's going to be above mid grade. Some of it's going to be excellent. But you're not going to produce excellent every single time. It's just a physical impossibility because everyone has opinions, and those opinions might not align with what you intended for that piece of content. So it's you just can't please everyone. Um, George Lucas, a lot of people like to look back at George's work and say, "Oh, George, it was Star Wars was perfect under George, and Disney's ruined it." And people forget that he made the Ewok films and the freaking Christmas special. Like those were horrific, horrific, horrific pieces of Star Wars content, which we still consumed because it was part of the journey. And we definitely criticized those things and made our voices heard. And George said, noted, and moved on and continued to make more Star Wars content, some of which was good, some of which was great, some of which was meh. And Disney is doing the exact same thing. So, as someone who is a Star Wars fan, um, I think that more people out there need to. I always say this to people in the comments: find your inner child. Because if you can find that inner child, that inner 5-year-old, 7-year-old kid who saw lightsabers for the first time and went, like, if you can find that inner, like, you will never be disappointed by anything that is ever produced in the franchises that you love. Will there be things you criticize and critique? Absolutely. Um, the Rise of Skywalker is definitely the weakest of all of the Star Wars films. Emperor Palpatine's back again. Like that was honestly one of the weakest things I've ever seen. I will criticize that till the day I die. But I also have to recognize that that film is something that my nephew, he grew up with that. He's 9 years old almost. That trilogy of films. I went to see that in the theater with him. Think about that for a minute. One of his first big theatrical experiences was going to see The Rise of Skywalker. And for a young child, I was, more than happy to take my nephew to see that because it's like I'm introducing you, he loves like The Last Jedi is his favorite film of all time. It's not my favorite film of all time. It did spawn My Stick is Better Than Bacon, which is, you know, but you know, looking back on the prequel trilogy as an example, 20 plus years later, at the time that it came out, we all made fun of Jar Jar Binks. I'd never critiqued Jar Jar Binks the way some people did. I did make fun of him. We always were like, Misa think it's just stupid. Like, he wasn't the greatest sidekick, but that's what George wanted. But some parts of those films were amazing. Like, the Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi segments from the first film, Darth Maul, like that lightsaber suit, the Duel of the Fates, like that sequence of music, um, the whole James Bond in space of the clone film with Obi-Wan Kenobi out there as a Jedi Master, you know, um, being a badass with his own, ship, um, Count Dooku, like, and then watching Revenge of the Sith and like that lightsaber sequence between Obi-Wan and Anakin, and I have the high ground sequence. You were my brother, and I hate you. And the conversion to Darth Vader, and just when he's about to kill Padme because he sees Obi-Wan on the ship. Like there are some extremely powerful moments in those prequel films, despite the fact that at the time we all had things we criticized about them. And it's the same thing with the modern trilogy. There are things that we critique about those films, but at the end of the day, they're Star Wars, and we love them because they're Star Wars. So I have no idea why I wanted to get on here and make a rambling video about this, but here it is. Be kind to each other when it comes to your fandom. There's nothing wrong with criticizing your Star Trek and your Star Wars, but you are absolutely 100% wrong if you claim that anything produced by Disney is bad just because it's Disney. Just saying. Star Wars, everybody. Find that inner child. Don't smother it. Don't let it die. Remember the feel the first time you saw lightsabers. See you in the next one, everybody. Stay safe.